All right, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, TBI and ABI Representation in Television and Film, Fact versus Fiction. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kim Myers and I'm a Community Outreach Specialist at the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey. The Alliance is a nonprofit organization with a mission to provide education, awareness, prevention strategies, and advocacy and support for those who are affected by brain injury. I would like to announce that we will be hosting another webinar on January 18th that will provide an overview of the Traumatic Brain Injury Fund, the TBI Fund. We will also have an upcoming webinar on February 13th about untangling the complex relationship between suicide and TBI. You can visit our website at bianj.com/webinars for more information and to register. Also, please save the date for our regional trainings for health and human service professionals. These trainings are open to any health and human service professionals. They are free. If you'd like to learn more about brain injury, please feel free to attend. The topic this year is brain injury in children and adolescents. Breakfast and lunch will be served, and we will be hosting them at 3 different locations throughout the state in North, Central, and South. In East Hanover, Monroe, and Cherry Hill. And more details will be available on our website soon. Lastly, save the date for our 42nd annual seminar for professionals. This is scheduled for May 1st, 2024 at the Palace in Somerset. We are currently accepting student poster proposals, award nominations, sponsorships, and exhibitors. So stay tuned for registration details. Before we begin the webinar, I would like to invite my colleague Sophie to give a brief overview of a TBI needs assessment, study, and focus groups that she's conducting right now that we're currently recruiting participants for. So Sophie, you could go ahead.
Hi. So we are currently conducting a study to identify the gaps in services for patients with traumatic brain injury, their caregivers, and service providers. We are doing, perfect. We are doing a survey and focus group. So if you want to take a minute to take the survey, there should be a QR code on your screen. You just scan that and it'll bring you right to our website where we kind of outline the surveys. There's 3 different ones, one separate for service providers, caregivers, and survivors. So you would take your respective survey, and then I think my email is on that one. If you are interested in our focus groups, the ones you see on the screen have currently, we've completed those, but we will be coming out with more dates shortly. So if you are interested in that, you can just send me an email and I'll put you on our list for more information. So I think I can put my email in the chat just in case it may be hard to see. And that's all. If you want to take a minute to take the survey, that'd be great.
Great, thank you, Sophie, for providing that overview. And you can scan the QR interested in participating, or email Sophie. Her email is on the slide, and she'll also be putting that in the chat. Now, just a few housekeeping notes before we begin the presentation. Attendees' microphones have been muted. If you have any questions during today's webinar, please type them in the QA box. We will get to as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available for viewing on the BIANJ website. Let me just pull up the presentation. And then also at the end of the webinar, a link will be sent for a post-webinar survey that will be placed in the chat. We do value your feedback, so you are encouraged to complete the survey. You must complete the survey in order to receive a certificate of attendance. Once you complete the survey, you'll automatically get this certificate of attendance in your email. So without further ado, our presenter today is Dr. Nicole Peniston. Dr. Nicole Peniston is a rehabilitation psychologist with Bancroft Neuro Rehab. She works with residents, day program patients, and outpatients in Plainsboro, New Jersey. She graduated from Widener University's Institute for Graduate Clinical Psychology in 2015, and she's worked with children and adults to address coping with autism spectrum disorder, depression, anxiety, trauma, workplace stress, and adjustment to injury and or medical status. Dr. Peniston has always had a strong interest in the way psychological and neurological issues are portrayed in the media. For example, her undergraduate dissertation focused on dissociative identity disorder in the media versus in clinical practice. In her treatment, she enjoys referencing books, podcasts, television, movies, and other forms of media to help patients feel appropriately represented and to help educate family members about their loved ones' experiences. So I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Nicole Peniston.
Thank you, Kim. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope everyone's having a good day in this chilly December. So today I'm going to be presenting about TBI, ABI representation in television and film. And so on our first slide, an introduction of just what we're going to cover today. So we're going to talk about the portrayal of traumatic brain injury and acquired brain injury, and the rehabilitation and recovery process that is often portrayed in television and film. We'll also briefly discuss how those portrayals have evolved over time or remained the same, misconceptions that are perpetuated in the media, and why the need for authentic representation is important. Also, the role that media plays in education and literacy about these topics. And then finally, we'll discuss the impact that the media portrayal of TBI and ABI has on the community, both the general public as well as the TBI ABI community, and what can be improved upon when the media is discussing these topics. So next slide. So the learning objectives are, after you've viewed this presentation, hopefully you'll be able to identify outdated or incorrect media references to TBI and ABI versus authentic representation of TBI, ABI treatment, rehabilitation, and recovery. And then also be able to provide references to movies or TV shows that can be helpful when offering psychoeducation to anyone affected by TBI or ABI. Next slide. And just before we start, I am going to be showing some clips during this presentation, and I wanted to offer a trigger warning. Some of these videos may be showing either real or dramatized portrayal of TBI or ABI or other neurological experiences, which could be considered harmful or traumatizing to some audiences. So I just want you to watch with care. And then also wanted to say that these clips are available in the public domain via YouTube. They're not owned by myself, and they don't represent opinions held by myself, Bancroft Neuro Rehab, or BINJ. Next slide. So to start off, I figured it would be helpful to review just some basic facts about traumatic brain injury or acquired brain injury. So these are two separate areas. An acquired brain injury is obviously something that has occurred to the brain to cause a problem. Often it is considered stroke, seizure. It can be a side effect of substance abuse, oxygen deprivation, infectious disease, tumor, or toxins. Whereas a traumatic brain injury is an insult to the brain caused from an external force, such as a fall, assault, motor vehicle accident, sports injuries, or combat injuries. Approximately 3.5 million people yearly are suffering from either an ABI or a TBI. And the number is likely higher because several people may experience these issues and not seek medical treatment, and then therefore they're not counted in the statistical analysis. Also worth mentioning, MTBI, mild TBI, previously known or often known as concussion, those numbers often are not counted because people may not be seeking treatment after experiencing a concussion, or may not even be diagnosed with concussion. So there's a lot of people who are affected by these areas, and so that's why it's important to discuss what we are learning from the media and how that can impact us if we are then suddenly find ourselves dealing with an ABI or TBI in our own personal lives or with our loved ones. Another statistics, 3.5 million people in the US approximately suffer from TBI-related disabilities. So this is a lifelong or chronic disease management. It can result in repeat hospitalization and in severe cases, death or early death from complications of TBI or ABI. Something that is going to come up later on, but worth reviewing now, is severity of TBI or ABI and the Glasgow Coma Scale. So I feel like a lot of people have probably heard about the Glasgow-Coma scale in the general media, although they don't go into depth about what it is. Essentially, it's measuring eye-opening, verbal, and motor responses, and it is a score on a scale of 3 to 15. The lower number, the more severe your current state is, and then the higher number, the more mild deficits that you may be presenting with. And the GCS or Glasgow-Coma scale is often used immediately after or shortly thereafter an injury to assess the severity and how someone's doing. And typically, the number on the GCS is a good predictor of how someone may be doing in their recovering and what their prognosis may be. So obviously, the more severe, the more concerns, the more damage there may be done, the more medical complications there may be, and then the milder, one would hope that they would have a more positive recovery. However, we do know now that people who have MTBI or mild TBI often are suffering with symptoms related to that for several years after, such as a post-concussive syndrome, which we won't be covering too much in this presentation, but just a fun fact for people to know. Symptoms of TBI and ABI are often physical, cognitive, and emotional, and are typically based on the area and the extent of the injury. So a lot of typical symptoms I've listed here. I'm not going to go through all of them because I'm sure you guys can read them, but a lot that I often see in working with this population are fatigue, coordination and balance issues, impaired memory and concentration, difficulty with attention, planning, and judgment. And then some of the more emotional or psychiatric issues like mood swings, anger, anxiety, depression, lack of motivation, difficulty with self-regulation. Another thing that can be really difficult for people is a lack of awareness of their deficits. So feeling like they can still do everything that they were able to do previous to their injury when people on the outside see that that's no longer the case. They're no longer as functional as they once were. And so coming to terms with that can be difficult. It can be part of just general acceptance and adjustment to injury, but it could also be a deficit of the injury, having difficulty understanding those deficits or being aware of those deficits. Some predictors of recovery and chronic disease management are typically things such as social support and access to care, which again, we'll talk about later when we're talking about these representations in the media, often don't really go into depth about the importance of those things. Also important to know that some complications of TBI and ABI can be seizure. You can start to have seizure problems after a TBI or an ABI. Drug poisoning. So this one is interesting. Maybe your brain is now reacting differently to substances, either prescribed or illicit, than it had prior. And so you could be having more severe effects after using those substances. And then there's also always the risk of infection or pneumonia. And then a lot of people find themselves socially isolated. They begin to use drug or alcohol to self-medicate. They are underemployed or unemployed and tend to have a general life dissatisfaction. This can be due to workplace, socialization, difficulty with self-care, and now find themselves dependent on others. Or they may feel like they don't want to burden their family, and so they're seeking out residential services, which can also be a very difficult adjustment for people, going from being independent and living on your own to now living in a group home. And then the other important thing about TBI and ABI, clearly the person most severely impacted is the one who sustained the injury. However, other people are impacted, including friends, families, healthcare providers, insurance companies, attorneys, educators, employers, and government agencies. And they're affected because they can all be involved in someone's care. Next slide. So hopefully these video clips will work, but we'll give it a second and see. But in general, a lot of times when you are seeing TBI or ABI in the media, it is either the main focus of the program or the plot line, or it can be a plot device. And unfortunately, more often than not, it is used as a plot device to forward the story or to make something more interesting or comical. And so because of that, because it's not being taken as seriously or as thoroughly as it should be, a lot of times inaccuracies can occur. And studies have shown that these inaccuracies in media occur across cultures and across countries. So it's not just in the US that we don't do a great job of educating. It tends to be just a general idea of when people are putting things out in the media to portray things for entertainment, they kind of lose some of the factual basis of it because honestly, a lot of times it's not fun or entertaining or sexy. So people may not want to watch it. And so people who are in charge of the creative aspect of entertainment may choose not to go in depth into ABI or TBI. So I'm not sure if the videos work. We can give it a try. If not, I am happy to just describe what would have been in the video. Oh, look, there it goes. So with this video, if you could start it at 1 minute and 56 seconds. Just for some background, this is from General Hospital, a soap opera from, and this is occurring in 1996. The background is this gentleman you see on the screen. He was the youngest son of a very wealthy family, a upstanding citizen, a honors student, and he suffered an injury in a drunk driving car accident. He was a passenger and was thrown from the car. And so this is shortly after he wakes up from being in a coma for an unspecified amount of time. So we can start.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. 3 conversations in one day. This has got to be a record. But I don't know why that would surprise me. You have surpassed my wildest dreams.
Have I?
Absolutely.
What happened to me?
You were in a car accident. A terrible, terrible car accident. And the doctors didn't think you were going to make it. But I knew better. My perfect son. I knew you wouldn't let me down.
Were you? What?
No, it's okay. You just, it's all right. Just relax. Just take it easy, okay? Okay. You're fine. I'm sorry. I know you don't know who I am yet. I'm your father.
Are you sure?
I'm positive.
Okay, we can stop that clip there. So this is an inaccurate portrayal for many, many reasons, but I chose it because I thought that the father's reaction to his son waking up from a coma and not recognizing him was not realistic at all. I think if most of us were in that situation, we'd be a little bit more upset or seeking doctors out to ask questions, but he takes it all very calmly. So that's not necessarily a realistic presentation. Also, as the father said that he'd been in a very terrible car accident. Well, frankly, he looks pretty good laying there in bed, probably because he's a handsome actor. And so they're not going to make him look terrible. But if someone had been in a really serious accident, thrown from a vehicle, which was a convertible, by the way, thrown from a convertible, you would expect them to have some bruising or swelling on their face, maybe be hooked up to more machines. And so this is really not an accurate physical portrayal of what's going on, typically after an accident like they're referring to. Another part about this that I thought they actually did somewhat of a good job with is showing agitation, how he was confused, and so he got a little bit agitated, clearly calms down very quickly, but agitation can be very common after someone is coming out of a coma. They did do, in prior scenes to this, did a pretty good job of showing the difference between moving from a coma to a minimally conscious state and then coming out of that state as well. But that's really not interesting to watch, how someone's changes in responses change. So it was done very, very quickly for the dramatic effect on this show. Another thing that is inaccurate in that clip, but I felt like we didn't need to watch it all the way through, is at one point the father says to him, the more that he sleeps, the sooner that he will remember things. And we know that that is also not true in recovery from a brain injury. So now we can look at the next clip. As we get it set up, I'll just let you know, this is from a movie called Falling for Christmas. It came out last year. It was Lindsay Lohan's return to the big screen. And so the plot of this is, well, you will see it, but you can start it at, I guess, 20 seconds in is good.
I just want people to remember me for more than my last name.
My lady.
Where exactly are we going?
Sierra Belmont, the last year with you has been truly magical. Will you marry me?
Oh, Dad! Oh, Dad!
I've got you!
Is it a dead body? Sheriff, could you please tell her to let me out of here?
First, we need to figure out who you are.
What do you mean, who I am? My name is...
So what are we supposed to do with her?
I have a place.
Does it have room service? Jingle bell, jingle rock.
Where am
Okay,
I?
we can stop that one there.
Are these...
So essentially, the plot of this movie, as you saw, a spoiled rich woman has a brain injury, and then suddenly she wakes up, doesn't know who she is, and in a romantic comedy trope, now becomes a nicer, better person and meets people and has a changed life. And so, again, this is inaccurate for many reasons. It is typically unlikely if someone is going to have a head injury that they would wake up and have no problem communicating and understand what's going on, but then not remember their own information. But that's all that they have trouble remembering. And what happens in this movie also, not necessarily authentic, but she's able to learn new information without problem, has no issues with attention or concentration, no physical issues, but yet just doesn't remember her name or where she came from. So we know that that's not authentic as well. And then another comment that happens in the clip, but also in the movie, is that a doctor in the movie tells her if she just goes about her day and does normal things, her memory will come back. And we know that that is not the case as well. And then we can show the last clip, and that one's going to start pretty late at 9 minutes and 58 seconds.
I know.
Is you.
Stay with me. Come on now. Come on now. Call the surgeon at once. It's me. A blanket. She's still shivering now.
To get to work. It is all my fault.
Anthony,
She's awake.
Mrs. Wilson heard from one of the maids.
I do not think that I can see her.
Do not lose her, Anthony. You cannot lose her.
I called on you. The morning after. I called on you to apologize. You deserved so much more than that. I did not want it to happen like that. So, I came to apologize.
Yes, you already
and
said
to
that.
ask you to marry me.
My lord, I do not need you to ask me anything at all.
Kate.
Okay, we can stop that one there. So that was just a compilation of things that happened throughout the season of Bridgerton. This is from Bridgerton season 2. But essentially, this character, she sustains, she's thrown from a horse, hits her head on a rock, and 2 days later wakes up looking beautiful, probably more beautiful than she did before the accident, and has no problems with memory, no issues whatsoever. So again, we know that that's unrealistic. In general, when we're thinking of media like current TV shows, movies, things like that, sports, medical dramas, and true crime shows usually do a slightly better job of having accurate portrayals of this. But we know from these examples, but also I'm sure you guys have seen a myriad of media such as comedy, drama, soap operas, action, superhero movies, sitcoms. They really don't do a very good job. One, because A lot of these tend to have a different purpose for using TBI or ABI. Again, it's usually used as a plot device, something to move things along or to make the storyline interesting, versus really wanting to show a true portrayal of what it's like for someone to experience that, which you may see in a medical drama, on true crime, or in sports. The next slide. Oh, wait, and so there's some additional examples there of other issues that have been recent, not realistic portrayals, so we don't really need to go in depth, but they're there if you're curious about them. So the next slide. So over the years, there have been some positive changes in the way that TBI and ABI has been portrayed in the media. The list that I have here are things that we still need to work on, that the media still needs to address to make these portrayals more realistic. A lot of times from a lot of films and things like that, you're going to see often it's women suffering from a brain injury, which we know the statistics show that men are more likely to suffer from brain injury. Age, race, ethnicity, cultural status, those are also often not really portrayed appropriately in the media, just as themselves. You know, you're not going to see a lot of older people in, fun, sexy comedies. You know, that's a limitation of media and how that we view age or gender or race or ethnicity. So representation in general, we know, is lacking in the media and is something that a lot of producers and story writers are working on improving. But especially when it comes to TBI and ABI, we're still seeing a lot of very attractive young white women suffering a TBI or an ABI from a silly accident. And we know that that's not necessarily realistic. In the defense of people who are creative and are using TBI, ABI in the media, a head injury is dramatic. It can capture the viewer's attention. It can make the actors need to evoke lots of emotions. And so I can understand why it might be used as a plot device, but if it's not done respectfully or correctly, it's really not helping anyone. Injury type, like I said, head injuries are usually portrayed. A lot of times it is a fall or a car accident. Interestingly enough, in a lot of action movies, there are multiple fights, but nobody's actually getting seriously injured, and we know that that's not realistic either. There is a study that was done that looked at 20 different action films, including things like Fast and Furious movies, Mission Impossible, James Bond movies. And in those 20 action films, there were a total of 930 head injuries, but 81% of those head injuries portrayed no symptoms whatsoever. And of the ones that did portray symptoms, it was loss of consciousness, and that was only brief. That was only portrayed in 87% of those. And then immediate recovery was portrayed in about 40 to 45% of those dramatized head injuries. Another interesting thing that study found was that main characters or important, significant characters tended to be less affected by an injury, even if they were, in a fight and were hit. They were less affected than a minor character who might actually be showing more realistic reactions to a fight, like loss of consciousness, bleeding, swelling, injury, things like that. And so that message is kind of like, well, if you're important, if you're special, you're not going to get as hurt as somebody who is not. Again, these are not intentional messages portrayed in the media, but they are things that we pick up on after a while, especially if you're consuming a lot of this type of media. There were also duplicate studies done about the way that action films or other films portray TBI in the media, and these studies are specific to TBI. Since 1988, there's been multiple studies, and all of them show that these films, regardless of the intention of the films, are giving misconceptions to the general public. So in a nutshell, these studies went to public areas like malls, college campuses, things like that, asked a bunch of random people if they'd seen, this list of movies that portrayed head injuries, and then asked them questions about head injuries. And most people were giving incorrect information or did not understand things, and they said that it was based on, well, I saw that in that movie, or I saw that in that TV show, so that's how I thought it was. And so that is kind of what ties it in. Why we're talking about this today is a lot of people in the general public, they're consuming this media. And even though everyone, who is well educated takes this with a grain of salt and realizes for dramatization purposes, if they're not getting other correct or educational opportunities on this topic, they're kind of taking what they see as fact, and then that's perpetuating misconceptions. So that's kind of why we're talking about this today. It can also impact how people see others with TBI. So let's say their third cousin, who they only see once a year, suffers a TBI, and then they see them at Christmas and they're like, why the heck are you still in a wheelchair and not up and around? I saw on TV this guy got messed up. Now, is somebody going to actually say that in person? Some people might. But other people might just be internally confused, like, well, I didn't think someone would still be having limitations, or I didn't think someone would still be in therapy or still have trouble with their memory. And that's something that a lot of these media portrayals don't share, is that these can be chronic deficits. It can be a lifelong condition. And so helping people understand that can help people interact in real life with survivors that they meet. Let's see. Also, other things that you're not going to see a lot in the media: physical disability, like in all those clips I showed, everybody looked beautiful right after their brain injury. We know that that's not always realistic. And then symptom presentation. A lot of times they're going to use amnesia as a plot device because it's fun, it's interesting, it's intriguing. If, what happens if someone lost their memory, who could they become? But you also often don't see the emotional or the behavioral symptoms that can happen after a TBI or an ABI, such as anxiety, depression, confusion, agitation, aggressiveness. A lot of those things, they don't take the time to portray in the media because it's complicated, it's messy, and it's not always attractive. People may not feel like the viewing audience wants to see that. Also, kind of like I alluded to before, TBI, you're going to see a lot more of that in the media than ABI. And I think it has to do with multiple factors. One, when we're thinking about things like stroke, age might be a factor. Or when we're thinking about things like what is the most dramatic thing that can happen to further along a story, it's going to be a sudden injury versus something that has occurred over time or has is less obvious to witness. It's more internal. Another thing I wanted to talk a little bit about in this is a lot of times when we hear stories about celebrities, real life people who just happen to be famous, who suffer a TBI or an ABI, we don't always get the full story. Or we see about their recovery, but we don't necessarily hear about the extent of their medical care or how costly it was or how long it took. And so even though it's great that these celebrities are speaking up about their experiences and bringing more representation in real life, celebrities, if they are of a certain level, they may have more finances or more access to care than the regular community. And so their stories may not always be realistic for the average person, but that doesn't mean it's not realistic for them. So celebrity stories can be important, but it can also be confusing for the general public. If they're in the same situation, they may not have the same access to services. Just a couple of fun facts before we move on. The earliest portrayal of TBI, of amnesia from an assault and a traumatic brain injury, occurred in 1915 in a film called The Right of Way. So it's been portrayed for a very long time. Some writers and creators and production studios are more mindful about doing accurate representation, others are not. So there has been an evolution over the years, but we still have a lot of work to do in that area. Just looking over my notes, I have a lot here and I want to leave time for questions. So we can move on to the next slide. So in the next slide, these are more accurate portrayals in the media. This first one, I'm not going to show just because I actually would love for people to watch the full short film. I think it's about 15 minutes long. So if you've got time, you can always check it out. It's available on YouTube. But it is a film about a young man who is diagnosed with a brain tumor, and walks him through the prognosis, treatment, recovery, and how it impacts both his own view of himself and his illness and his brain and his body, but also how it impacts his family. And it's really a very beautifully done film. So if someone has the time to watch it, I would highly recommend it. The second clip we can watch briefly. We can start it at about 25 seconds in. Just to set it up, this is Heather McDonald's a comedian, and she was on stage and actually suffered a neurological incident and a head injury on stage during her comedy set. So this is not a skit. She's not pretending. This is actually what occurred for her.
My doctor told us about GoodRx to help us save money on our prescriptions.
Did you know that?
I don't mean to brag. I don't care.
How many seconds in did you say?
About 25.
Okay.
It's not a very long clip, so it's
fine. Never got COVID. Clearly, Jesus loves me the most. Seriously. So nice. So nice.
Okay, we could stop that one there because nothing else really happens. But Heather McDonald herself wanted this out in the public for people to see. She didn't disclose what type of neurological incident she had, but as you can see, she slurred her words a little bit and stumbled and fell. When she fell, she did fracture her skull. She did a news interview, I think a week or two later, talking about it. And she thought that it was really important that people see what happens, so that way, if it happens to their loved ones, or they know what to do. And I thought that it was a very realistic portrayal, because if this happens, when you were out in public, you might not know what to do at first. But then, as you saw, multiple audience members were calling for help. Some people were on their cell phones. Security did come out, turn her on her side, so that way, if she was seizing, she wouldn't have any problems. And she did receive medical treatment immediately thereafter. And luckily, she ended up being okay. The Wendy Williams show, we don't need to show the clip because I'm sure many people have seen it, and it's probably only like 10 seconds long, but Wendy Williams also collapsed on her show. It is a realistic portrayal of someone having an incident. You don't really see any medical attention, and it looks like she didn't have any medical attention initially. So that's not great, but it's realistic. A lot of times people may have a seizure or something unusual happens and they don't seek medical treatment right away. So while it may not be the best portrayal, it's an accurate portrayal. And then there's several movies listed here about realistic portrayals of different types of TBI, but also ABI, which I feel like that can be a little harder to find. And they're all really good. Some of them, like Breaking Bad and Homeland, it's happening over a series of episodes in a series, where the others are television shows or movies where you're going to find all the information that you need in one clip. But I think that they're really good examples in different ways. I know that if you've ever seen the movie Memento, it's an action thriller. There's a lot going on, but it really does show a very good portrayal of how TBI can be traumatic for people, and the healthy and unhealthy coping skills that people may use. And then also what anterograde amnesia would look like. It does a really good presentation of that. So we can move on to the next slide. The one thing about the accurate portrayals, documentaries in the news tend to be the most representative, but it may not necessarily capture how every individual feels. So that's the thing to take with a grain of salt. They might be showing it realistically, but someone may not identify with it. And so the other part of TBI and ABI in the media is that the portrayals of rehabilitation, treatment, and recovery are typically not realistic. And a lot of times that's because a lot of that stuff is not entertaining. Immediacy of treatment's a big one. A lot of times in real life, people may not have access to the treatment that they need right away, or they're getting treatment, but perhaps they need more specialty treatments. And so on TV or in the movies, somebody's getting treatment right away, or they don't even need treatment at all. So that's not necessarily realistic. Access to services, again, that can be due to a number of reasons, but a lot of times in TV shows and in film, oh, they're able to get into the hospital and see a doctor right away. We also know that that's not always the case. Prognosis in film, usually the prognosis is always really great and nobody has to worry about long-term effects. We know in real life that's not always the case. Then the financial, social, and emotional cost. Film, TV does a really terrible job of going into that, again, because it's not always entertaining. It can be really difficult to watch, difficult to experience, and make it difficult to accurately portray. And so that might be why there are some limitations in the media. And then finally, I think one of the areas that really needs to be improved is people's expectations regarding the recovery process and any guilt that's associated with it. So I'll go into that for a minute. Expectations as far as how long it's going to take for recovery and rehabilitation, what is realistic to expect versus what is not realistic. Again, in TVs and movies, somebody's fine by the end of the film. It all gets tied up nicely in a little bow and everybody moves forward, but we know that that's not the case. Also, guilt about the recovery process. So this can be on both sides. It could be for the person who's injured. Maybe they feel guilty about not being able to fulfill their family roles or return to work, or feel like they're a burden on their family. Or it could be guilt on the other side of families, doctors, caregivers about not being able to do more for the person who was injured. And so sometimes you might see some guilt or expectations in the media, but a lot of times they're looking for the more flashier things. They're not going to look at these difficult emotional topics. One, because it's not entertaining, and two, it's not cleaned up as quickly by the end of a 2-hour movie or by the end of a 45-minute episode. A couple things that I'm sure we've all either seen or heard as far as rehabilitation, treatment, and recovery that is not realistic is the old trope of if you hit your head and you have a head injury, just hit your head again, you'll be fine. We all know that's not true, but it happens a lot in TV, in media, in films. Another thing you often see is people recover the instant that they, see their long lost aunt or go to their childhood home or pick up a baseball bat. We know that that's not true, that those things don't always trigger recovery or recall or improvement of memory deficits. Also, a lot of times they show in the media if someone undergoes hypnosis, they'll suddenly get their memory back or they'll suddenly be fine. We know that that's not always true, and typically it's not a treatment for TBI or ABI at all. Although in the movies, they like to act like it can be. Another odd thing that tends to happen in movies, and I think it's more for a plot device, is the minute someone gets back their old memories, they lost all the new memories. So it didn't happen in the movie, but let's say Lindsay Lohan gets her memory back in that movie. Then she suddenly forgets that she was nice again and she goes back to being a spoiled brat. That's not realistic. That's not what happens. But for some reason, it's a fun plot device that a lot of people like to use. And then finally, in a lot of movies or TV shows, someone will undergo neurosurgery as a treatment for their TBI or ABI, or neurosurgery may have caused their TBI or ABI for some bizarre reason. And so this thing can be either life-saving or life-destroying. Obviously, we know that surgeries can be necessary if you're suffering a TBI or an ABI. But again, you're not going to wake up for the surgery and be 100% like people often are in the film. So we can go to the next slide. So again, I kind of said before, but why is authentic representation important? Why are we talking about this at all? Regardless of why someone's creating a film or a TV show, media is a form of communication. It's a form of education. People are learning things and getting information from these sources. And so it needs to be considered if it's realistic or not. That being said, I'm not saying that everything needs to be dark and serious. You can have a comedy where someone has amnesia. Just do a little blurb in the beginning. This is not a realistic representation, or this is not based on fact. You can still enjoy your film about it. But I think people who don't take this media as what it's meant to be, as a comedy or a drama, they're thinking that this is what it's really like. And that can be harmful. It may not be harmful on an individual level. Individuals may watch and say, oh yeah, that was just a movie. It's not real life. But on a community level, these are messages that are being portrayed. And so it's letting the general public know that, hey, this is what it's like, whether that's true or not. Also, if media is doing a better job of authentic representation, it's going to increase literacy and understanding for the general public. It's only going to do positive things by giving people more appropriate information and understanding. It's not necessarily going to take away from entertainment value or anything like that. It's just going to add a different nuance to these films. And then the community impact. People who are currently going through this, people who it just happened yesterday, people who might be impacted in the future. All of these people are getting messages from the media. Whether they believe the messages or not, that's up to them. That's the individual level. But for the community or the global level, we want to be disseminating the appropriate information, the correct information. And then obviously there are other ways where that appropriate information can be out there through public policy, social media, community action, health services information. So it's out there, but it's just not necessarily out there in these venues where those links can be added at the end of the film. I mean, we've all seen a movie that said, if you or someone needs help, please call the National Suicide Hotline. We could do something like that if there's TBI or ABI in a film, provide links or phone numbers for support communities so people can find out the real information if they want it. And the next slide, which kind of goes into what I just talked about, ideas for improvement. So like I said, offering those resources to brain injury organizations, consulting with people in the community who are affected, consulting with professionals. Under the accurate portrayals that I listed, there's a movie called The Writer from 2017. And even though it's a dramatization, the main actor, I believe, and I believe two other actors in the movie, are actually brain injury survivors. So they know what it's like. And they are now portraying in a dramatic way what occurs, but they definitely had a connection. And so they were very mindful about an accurate portrayal of injury and recovery and rehabilitation and how it impacts their life. So in that example, that director sought out those people and was able to use the community, to use survivors, to use professionals to do an accurate portrayal, but still offer entertainment as well. So it's possible. And then, like I said before, we want to offer clear information about injury and the process, or links to that information if it doesn't have a place within the creative media itself. The other part of it is we want to be sensitive to people who are part of the TBI or ABI community or have loved ones or work in the community. We want to acknowledge that this is not a joke, it's not a game, and that people go through this every day, but they still can lead full lives. They can have families who love and support them. They can have positives in their lives, but it's not necessarily going to end up like Lindsay Lohan at the end of the movie, where she's a rich billionaire and marries the guy who owns the inn. We want to be sensitive, but also realize we know that media is not always factual. And then the final slide that I have here, I'm not going to go through all of it, but here's a list of movies, documentaries that do a really good job of presenting accurate portrayals and can be really good for use of psychoeducation if people want to know more about these things. And so they're all available. I put where you can stream them for free. And then obviously there's a myriad of other information out there. There's no way I could possibly watch every single thing about brain injury in the media out there. So I tried to kind of get a smattering of the last about 20 years or so to talk about in this presentation. So that concludes me rambling on. I was wondering if I see there's some questions in the chat, if anyone wanted to have some questions or discussions about these topics. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say.
Thank you so much for that informative presentation, Dr. Peniston. We can take a few questions now. I can field those questions. So I see one question. Do you ever see that TBI is shown as a consequence of domestic violence and interpersonal violence?
That's a really great question. And fun fact about myself, before becoming a psychologist, I was a domestic violence probation officer. So it's definitely something I'm on the lookout for. And I feel like while domestic violence is portrayed in the media, I don't necessarily think that there are a lot of accurate portrayals of TBI due to that. I think it's one of those things just like any other injuries from domestic violence, we see, someone is assaulted, someone's in the hospital, but then they're home a few days later. So they're really not covering that aspect of it. But it's definitely something that the media can improve upon because it is something that occurs in that community.
Absolutely. Thank you for your response. A couple of people asked, how can individuals and organizations advocate for more accurate and sensitive portrayals of TBI and ABI in the media?
So from my opinion, and this is just my opinion, social media is great for that. You watch a movie or something, there are folks who they're the social media manager. That is their job, to see what people are saying out there on social media. And so that's one of the easier ways to get in touch and advocate for appropriate portrayals. I think the other part too is talking more with friends, with family on social media about where we're getting it right, advertising those, promoting the places that are getting it right, so then people can compare that and be like, oh yeah, that's not like the Lindsay Lohan movie. And don't get me wrong, I adore Lindsay. I thought it was a very cute movie. But the harm in it is that it's giving people this misconception about what a brain injury and amnesia can be.
Absolutely. And have you ever observed any positive changes over time in media portrayals of TBI, ABI? Do you feel like it's been getting better with time, improving with time, or do you feel like it's kind of still has a lot more room for improvement? Are there any trends you've been noticing?
I definitely feel like there's a lot of room for improvement. I think a big impact that was helpful was the movie Concussion, and talking about CTE. That was definitely bringing more attention to concussion and CTE. But I think that's just one very specific area, and there's a whole world of TBI that we could use that same sort of advocacy and dissemination of appropriate knowledge on. So I think it's great that that stuff is out there and people are more aware, but there's more work to be done.
Absolutely. Thank you for your response. And a couple of people had specific examples. Someone said the best thing about TBI that I saw recently was in the ABC News special about after the blast, about Bob Woodruff's return to Iraq. 16 years after an explosion causes TBI. They felt that that covered his recovery in TBI very nicely. Someone else said the Harrison Ford movie regarding Henry. There's some good examples in there. Another question
regarding Henry's a classic. I didn't put it in there because I'm like, oh, everybody knows that one.
And then another question, what advice, you went over some of it in the presentation, but what other advice would you give to media creators, even maybe social media creators that want to create content, maybe raise an awareness of brain injury or brain injury related issues? How would you suggest that they go about doing that in a sensitive way?
I think definitely connecting more with the community, reaching out to BIAA or BIANJ or whatever their local organizations are, getting information, reaching out to local hospitals or trauma treatment centers, just talking to people who they go through this every day. And I think in general, the media is doing more of that as a whole. A lot more times they're going and talking to a brain surgeon if they're going to do brain surgery. But it seems like in the moment, they want to portray brain surgery, so let's get a brain surgeon on staff to consult if we showed this correctly. But then they're not going the extra step or going the extra mile and saying, okay, what happens after brain injury? So I think definitely creators have good intentions, and I think those are improving, but representation isn't going to happen until the community itself is making more of a noise about it. I mean, we see that in all other areas. When representation has improved, it's because there's more people speaking out, speaking to friends, to family, doing more public policy and advocacy. That's really going to help the content creators be more realistic in their representation.
Great. Thank you for that response. And then you went over this a little bit in the presentation as well, but are there other specific genres or platforms where you feel like they are more accurate in their portrayals? And why do you feel like that's the case, that those certain genres or platforms are more accurate?
I think the genres that are more accurate, like I said, medical dramas, true crime, because I think they are a little bit more thoughtful of, they're not using it as a plot device. They're not using it as something kitschy or fun on the side. This is the focus of what they're talking about. So they want to be more accurate in those portrayals. I think it's more accurate in sports, thanks to all of the CTE research and stuff that's out there. So now they are talking about it more, both in dramatic sports shows and actual, sports casting. because it's impacted them, so they can't ignore it anymore. I think social media is always tricky. We're talking about anything. I can just think of, there's always been trends on TikTok about people portraying, let's say, a mental illness, but they don't actually have it, or claiming that they have a diagnosis, but they don't. And so social media is always tricky, but I think the intention of social media is to tell people's personal stories. So if there's people out there sharing their true experiences, I think that can also be a great way for accurate portrayals and then other people to become informed. And content creators, they're out there on social media too, so that might spark their interest and be like, hey, this is what I need to change in what I'm doing.
Okay, great. And then kind of going along with the advocacy question, if someone is outraged about a certain commercial or portrayal and really want to speak up about it, you had kind of gone over some methods in which to do this through social media, speaking up, leaving comments, getting friends and family involved. Are there any other ways that you would suggest, say a corporation puts out a commercial that they feel is inaccurate or they're outraged about? How can they go about speaking up against that?
Yeah, go right to the source. Reach out, find the contact information for that organization. You can call them, write them letters, send them emails, ask, who's in charge of this commercial? Because the president of Subaru didn't make the commercial. It was probably some minion somewhere, but that's okay. Reaching out and saying, like, I saw this commercial, it made me feel this way. This is what I want you to fix. Because honestly, at the end of the day, they want commercials to catch your attention and impact you. If it's not doing it in the right way, they probably want to hear your input. They want to know, like, okay, this commercial worked. You watched it. You paid attention. What can I fix? So more people watch it and pay attention.
Absolutely. Thank you. That all makes sense. Thank you for that response. Are there any other questions? I'm going through the chat just to make sure I didn't miss any. And it looks like we have like 2 minutes left if someone has one other question. Someone mentioned the Vow film. How soap operas are less accurate. All right, so if there's no more questions, we can, maybe one more. So it looks like Chris put the the evaluation in the chat. So if anyone would like to fill out the evaluation, we do value your feedback. Please go ahead to the chat and fill that out. And then you can receive your certificate of attendance automatically in your email when you fill that out. So that's in the chat now. And just looking through one more time. Yep, so Christine, you can access the survey through the chat, through the link in the chat. So thank you again, Dr. Peniston, for sharing your expertise with us today. If anyone's question was not answered, you can email me at kmyers@bianj.org. That's KMYERS@bianj.org, and I will reach out to Dr. Peniston and see if I can get an answer. So one final reminder to please complete that post-webinar survey. The link can be found in the chat, and then you'll automatically receive a certificate of attendance via email once you complete that. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for your thoughtful comments and questions. And we hope to see you at the January 18th and the February 13th webinars as well. So that concludes today's webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peniston.